Good evening, everyone. As I mentioned at Mass, I just got back a couple of days ago from Mexico. I was asked to be a part of a delegation from the U.S. to witness the Pope's visit, and we were only invited to the Masses each day that the Pope celebrated. So I was not privy to the other events. So I read about them or saw them on the news. And it was the last day of the 5-day visit in Juarez when things started coming together for me. And particularly as I read his statements to the prisoners in Juarez, and also the one to business leaders in Juarez. And he talked about, they weren't long speeches, but they were right to the point. And he talked about human capital, about investing in human capital. And that when we don't, when we're primarily about financial profits, and we disregard the human capitals and that is the foundation of a society that allows a society to be healthy. And it's no news to any of us, Mexico is very sick. Mexico is tremendously ill on many levels. On the level of government with its corruption, on the level of violence from the cartels and from the gangs, on the level of economics where people can't find jobs to sustain their families, on the level of hope where young people don't see any future. And so they begin to wander. And so they are susceptible to temptations of drugs, of violence, of being caught in to the industry of the cartels. And all of that, for those who are sane, leads to migration. Let's get the heck out of here. And so it dawned on me at that moment that all of these things that Pope Francis was talking about throughout his 5-day journey, as he talked to families, as he talked to young people, as he talked to prisoners, as he talked to government, as he talked to business leaders, that they're all connected about investing in families, investing in a healthy society. How do we get back to a healthy society? It's looking at what's most fundamental to being human. Hope. He summed it up in his 3 T's. Trabajo, techo, y tierra. Work, roof, and land. Basic things that give humans dignity. I've got a place to live. I've got a roof over my head. And I've got work that sustains my dignity, that I can contribute something positive to society. And he was very direct to government leaders. It's your responsibility to work on those very basic structures that allow families and individuals to thrive. And he talked to families that it's your responsibility to love and to forgive and to be merciful and to teach and to learn and to cooperate. And he talked to the young people. He said, we need you not to give up hope. Study, work, look for a future that benefits the people around you. We need you. And he said several times, he says, Mexico is rich. And it's rich not only because of the mining in the mountains, it's rich because of the people. It has young people. It has vibrant people with great dreams and hopes that are many times dashed. Allow those hopes to develop. Allow a pathway for them to become reality. So, and that's when it dawned on me that all of this Pope Francis's message, as it developed from theme to theme, that it was all in the message of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Her message was one of human dignity. Her message was one about society, about justice, about the church. I want you to build me a temple where I can show God's loving and merciful gaze. You remember someone else who talked about a merciful gaze? Pope Francis. It's interesting, the very words that Mary spoke to Juan Diego, her merciful gaze. And I think that's why he spent all of that time allowing Mary to gaze on him. And he shared that gaze with a country that is very wounded. A gaze of mercy, gaze of compassion, the gaze of a pastor. So that being said, what does Pope Francis ask of us as peacemakers? I would say, just as he pointed out to various groups of Mexicans, whether it was government officials or young people in the plaza, he asks a lot. Albert Einstein once said, peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice, of law, of order. In short, of government. And the church could not agree more with that. But the church's rich teaching on peace goes even further. As Pope Francis wrote in The Joy of the Gospel, peace is not simply the absence of warfare based on a precarious balance of power. It is fashioned by efforts directed day after day towards the establishment of the ordered universe. Are we okay? No? No, it's good. Peace is not simply the absence of war based on a precarious balance of power. It's fashioned by efforts directed day after day towards the establishment of the ordered universe, willed by God, with a more perfect justice among men. In the end, a peace which is not the result of integral development will be doomed. It will always spawn new conflicts and various forms of violence. So peace needs a firm and strong foundation of relationships that are right, that are ordered, of justice. A lot is asked of us as peacemakers because peace is more than the absence of war. It is built on a foundation of justice. The church's teaching on war and peace does not only apply to times of conflict, but it also applies to the building of peace through justice, to the prevention of violence. This is what Pope Paul VI meant by his famous admonition, if you want peace, work for justice. Peace must be waged carefully through strategic initiatives to address injustices and promote the welfare of people. For this reason, respect for human rights, the protection of migrants, the promotion of religious freedom, and the fight against poverty and for economic justice are investments in peace. Lasting peace is never established by force of arms alone. It can't be. Winning wars are short-term projects that require moral guidance and restraint. True peace is a long-term project that requires respect for human rights and the promotion of justice for all. The church sees the protection of human rights and investments in foreign aid to reduce poverty and desperation as peace-building activities. In the words of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, respect for and development of human life requires peace. Peace is not merely the absence of war, and it is not limited to maintaining a balance of powers between adversaries. Peace cannot be attained on earth without safeguarding the goods of persons, free communication among peoples, respect for the dignity of persons and peoples, and the assiduous practice of fraternity, namely relationships. Peace is the work of justice and the effect of charity. Each of us is called to be a peacemaker, and in a democracy that makes special demands of us as people of faith who are citizens. We're called to be faithful citizenship, to borrow a phrase from the bishop's statement on political responsibility. We must not only be people disposed to peace, we must be champions of justice. In the joy of the gospel, Pope Francis admonishes us, the new evangelization calls on every baptized person to be a peacemaker and a credible witness to a reconciled life. In a culture which privileges dialogue as a form of encounter, it is time to devise a means for building consensus and agreement while seeking the goal of a just, responsive, and inclusive society. So being a peacemaker requires being a builder of a more just and inclusive society. And that's one of the things that Pope Francis noted in Mexico as he visited the indigenous communities. They need to be included in society of Mexico. And so that in government, in decision making. He calls us to be peacemakers. It also calls us to welcome the stranger and to welcome those fleeing wars and violence. In this January's address to Diplomatic Corps, Pope Francis lifted up the plea of thousands of people who weep as they flee horrific wars, persecutions and human rights violations, or political or social instability, which often make it impossible for them to live in their native lands. It is the outcry of those forced to flee in order to escape unspeakable acts of cruelty toward vulnerable persons, such as children or the disabled, or martyrdom solely on the account of their religion. In this address, Pope Francis is linking two issues: the plight of migrants and refugees on the one hand, and war and violence on the other. In a sense, the displacement of people from their homes is both a consequence of war and a call to act. But this call to act is twofold. We must act to remove the underlying causes of displacement and aid the displaced until peace can be restored. So it's a two-phased response. We have to respond in the humanitarian sense, the immediate needs, but then we have to look at how do we build up again that foundation of justice so that peace can prevail. I had the opportunity to view up close the issue of migration due to war and violence during a solidarity visit to the Middle East last month. Refugees give a face to the horrors of war and persecution. I was impressed with the work of Catholic Relief Services. I'm sure you're familiar with the US-based Relief and Development Agency. CRS is partnering with local Caritas agencies in Jordan and Lebanon to provide assistance to both host populations and refugees. They provide aid to Christians, Muslims, and other religious and ethnic minorities alike. In Jordan, we visited with Iraqi refugees, many of whom had been traumatized by the advance of ISIS on Mosul and the Nineveh plains. They found safety in Jordan, but little else to help them rebuild their lives, little else to restore true peace. They cannot work legally. Their children lack any future. Many of them are not going to school. And so most desire to be resettled, and they've been waiting, some of them for a couple of years to be resettled. And so they're simply sitting around. They're in safety, but their lives are on hold, very sadly, as they await, and they have no idea when it'll happen, if it'll happen, to be resettled to a third country. I remember this last summer, I was visiting in Malaysia and Indonesia, where they have received many refugees from the East and from the Middle East. And I met with a group of women. They had a support group. And there was a lady from Iraq who, she and her husband were professionals. I forget what work her husband had done before, but she had a doctorate in computer programming. And she had been waiting for 5 years in Malaysia without a work permit. She said, all I want to do is contribute. I have some things to contribute to society. I would love to have a computer programmer in my diocese. But I can't offer her a visa. And so those are some of the difficulties that we see. In Lebanon, we met with both Syrian and Iraqi refugees. Lebanon is burdened with a population of refugees equal to 50% of their total population. Imagine that, 50%. There are 2 million refugees in a country with a native population of 4 million. So if we translate that to the United States, that would equal about 160 million refugees. So when we hear complaints about countries in the Middle East not doing their fair share, maybe we should apply that formula to the U.S. And so 10,000 sounds much more palatable. Some of the politicians, as we know, when they speak about the arrival of tens of thousands of refugees from overseas, or even unaccompanied minors fleeing drug and gang violence south of the border. And so we see this lack of generosity, this promotion of the politics of fear that was not present in Lebanon or in Jordan. We saw a tremendous generosity both in Jordan and in Lebanon, countries with far fewer resources at their disposal. 2 summers ago, when we first encountered that the flood of the southern border of minors from Central America and mothers with young children, it was the Border Patrol was overwhelmed. ICE was overwhelmed. And so they reached out to the local churches. And we were glad to open our doors as shelters to temporarily house these refugees. I always refer to them as refugees because that's truly what they were. They're seeking refuge from violence. These were the good ones. These are the mothers who don't want their 10-year-old daughters to be raped. They don't want their 9-year-old sons to be recruited into violent, brutal gangs. And so they're looking for peace, they're looking for life. My frustration as we opened up shelter for them, and we did that at our cathedral in Las Cruces. And the outpouring was tremendous across faith lines, across every line. People responded tremendously with tremendous generosity. Thank goodness. But one of the frustrations for me as I listened to the national conversation or debate that ensued was, how do we close the borders? See, they're not closed yet. And I found it somewhat infantile that we're talking about, we have a terrible disease in society. And we're talking only about treating the symptoms. That makes no sense. If you go to a doctor who treats only symptoms and not the cause of a disease, he ought to be fired. And maybe we should fire some of our politicians. Of course, that was not in my script, but Pope Francis goes off script sometimes too. But part of and I think part of the reason why we didn't get to, because politicians are smart, that they didn't go there is because there's violence in Central America, violence that's beyond the pale, and they're unsustainable communities and societies. I have a friend, a priest friend in Guatemala, and he's called me several times and said, Oscar, can I come stay with you for a few weeks? The gangs are threatening me because I've been doing things for my parishioners to try to help them. And he's had to come hide for a while. I have priests in my diocese who are in hiding because they have been threatened, and so on. And so, but if there is violence and there are drugs that have corroded society in Central America, then who is causing the demand for drugs? It's us. It's America. Some of the politicians will use the politics of fear. The Mexicans are bringing drugs in, and yes, they are, but who's buying them? Who's using them? And so we're complicit. If we go to the core of the disease, then we're complicit in it. But I think that we have to own up to that in order to be, to honestly look at how do we get to a fix? How do we fix the problem? How do we cure the disease? I had the honor, as I mentioned, of representing the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops during the Holy Father's recent visit to Mexico. And it was particularly poignant that he celebrated Mass and visited the border between the U.S. and Mexico to dramatize the plight of migrants. The plight of unaccompanied minors and families on our southern border is not so different from that of persons fleeing war and persecution in the Middle East. Since 2011, the United States has seen an unprecedented increase in unaccompanied children and families from Central America migrating into the country. A perfect storm of root causes or push factors has contributed to this dramatic increase, including violence exacerbated by gangs, the drug trade and economic desperation, a weak rule of law, and low trust in government institutions, unemployment, the lack of quality education and access to it, and the resulting inability of individuals to support themselves and their families in their home countries. I've talked to families who came to the border and said they were living a decent life. They had a small family business in Central America, but the gangs began to demand a cut of their profits, and kept going up such that they were not able to sustain themselves. That, coupled with the violence, the insecurity, what do you do? Anybody that's sane would probably flee. And that's what they were doing. In the U.S., many migrants are detained in an already overburdened immigrant detention system, which grew more than fivefold between 1994 and 2013. Reflecting on the current state of affairs, Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio of Brooklyn noted that there are ways to create a humane system and also ensure immigrants are complying with the law. But we have created a detention industry in this country, which preys upon the vulnerability of our fellow human beings, the vast majority of whom are not criminals. We remember that crossing the border without proper documentation is a civil offense, not a criminal one. The U.S. bishops have stated that all persons have the right to remain in their homeland and to find there the means to support themselves and their families in dignity. So, an important teaching with regard to migration. The Catechism tells us that peoples have a right to migrate, to be able to sustain and to sustain their families. But even before that, they have a right not to migrate. In their home country, that country has a responsibility for a social structure such that people can make a living. And so there has to be some pressure and some aid to make that possible, whether it's in Mexico, whether it's in Central America, or whether it's going to be in rebuilding Syria and rebuilding Iraq. To achieve this goal, there needs to be peace and justice, for safety and security, for educational and employment opportunities. To reduce the flow of migrants, it's critical to address the underlying causes of violence. U.S. policies must reflect the importance of controlling the flow of illicit drugs, curbing corruption at every level, and curtailing the arms trade and human trafficking. We must also give people alternatives to lives of criminal activity, often driven by economic desperation. When I was auxiliary bishop in San Antonio, there's a group of bishops that gather twice a year, and there were wonderful, wonderful visits. We call it the Tex-Mex bishops on either side of the border, those who lined on the Mexican side and the Texas side, and we would gather, and because we dealt with the same families who came and went, and just to see what our policies were and what we can do, and we always made public statements to help in that regard. And one of the bishops in Mexico, in the state of Chihuahua, told us this story of a program that he had started, and it was a retreat for 8 and 9-year-old boys. It was a 4-day retreat. And at the end of this 4-day retreat, each of the boys was asked to make a pledge that he will never assassinate. 8 and 9-year-old boys. Rather than making the Scouts' oath, they're pledging that they will never assassinate. Because that's how young they're recruiting them. Our nation's trade policy must reflect principles of just development. The United States, as a wealthy country, should reduce the subsidies, tariffs, and quotas that severely constrict the ability of poorer countries to market their products and sustain their agriculture. U.S. international assistance should focus on poverty reduction and inclusive development. Expansion of employment opportunities in the region would help to reduce poverty and the incentive for many migrants to look for employment in the United States. Implementation of economic policies that create living wage jobs is vital, especially for those without advanced skills. Investment in health, housing, and educational systems will help enhance employment opportunities. People are people. They want the same things in life. They want to form and raise families in dignity. And for this, they need peace and they need justice. If anything that I've learned traveling to the Middle East or to Africa or to the Far East or to Latin America is that families are looking for the same thing. They're looking for the American dream in their own country. But it's the lack of peace and of justice that forces them to flee. One refrain that I heard over and over from refugees in the Middle East is that they desperately wanted peace restored to that troubled region. Only an inclusive and just peace would enable families to return to their countries. For this reason, I wrote to Secretary Kerry upon my return. And these are some of the reflections that I shared with him. The Holy See and the U.S. Bishops' Conference welcomed the adoption of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action by the U.S. and the P5+1 partners with Iran. In fact, the Holy See expressed the hope that the full implementation of the comprehensive plan will ensure the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and will be a definitive step toward greater stability and security in the region. That's from the Holy See. Our nation needs to build on this achievement and to pursue peace in Syria. The timely release of U.S. sailors whose ship wandered into Iranian waters and the recent return of U.S. prisoners are signs that the agreement with Iran may be fostering wider positive results. Undoubtedly, pursuing peace in Syria and isolating extremists in Syria and Iraq are difficult missions, but they are not impossible ones. In both Syria and Iraq, it is critical to promote inclusive governance so that all ethnic and religious groups have a stake in peace. Both global and regional powers need to be part of the solution as well. The United States, working with global and regional powers, with Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the Syrian government and opposition, will need to be creative and flexible if the UN-led peace talks are to bear fruit. Having just visited the region, I can testify to the fact that the Middle East is in chaos, and the human suffering runs deep. While peace is pursued, it's critical for our nation to exercise continued and redoubled efforts to deliver humanitarian assistance to displaced populations. The needs are simply outstripping the available resources. Jordan and Lebanon have been remarkably generous in response to the call to welcome the stranger, and at great cost to their social structures. The president's budget needs to increase both U.S. assistance to help host populations and to strengthen humanitarian assistance. As Americans, we need to urge Congress and the administration to be generous. If peace talks are successful, the United States and the international community will need to provide robust assistance to help rebuild Syria so that refugees can return and the social fabric can be repaired. Post-war desperation will only fuel renewed conflict and extremism. Our nation knows how to build peace in the wake of war. We did it with the Marshall Plan after World War II. Now we need to do it again in Syria and Iraq. Church leaders with whom we met are particularly concerned to preserve the Christian presence in the region, the birthplace of Christianity. This presence is not only important for the church, but also for stability in the region. As one religious leader put it, Christians can live without the Middle East, but the Middle East cannot live without Christians. Their presence is important for encouraging tolerance and for respect for pluralism. They are integral members of their society in the Middle East. In our visits with Christian refugees, we heard harrowing stories of persecution by ISIS and other extremists. It's clear that they want to cleanse the region of Christians and other ethnic and religious minorities, and even of Muslims who dissent from their distorted, narrow, extremist ideology. The path ahead will be arduous, but the time is long past for the international community to pursue diplomacy and peace in Syria and in the region. In the final analysis, only peace will end the refugee crisis. Preserve the Christian presence and allow inclusive societies to be built that respect the human rights of all. So, to go back to the original question, what does Pope Francis ask of us as peacemakers? A lot. Number one, he calls us to pray. To pray for the gift of peace, we must work for it as well. Prayer doesn't change God, it changes us. Prayer places us in solidarity with refugees and migrants fleeing violence, and it inspires us to aid them and to work for peace and justice. Number two, we must urge policymakers to be generous in receiving refugees and migrants in our own nation. We should protect Latin American youth fleeing gangs and violence, not prosecute them. We should resettle a fair share of the most vulnerable refugees fleeing conflicts in the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere. And thirdly, we must advocate for justice in our nation and in the world. Peace, lasting peace, can only be built on the foundation of justice. Our nation must use all of the diplomatic resources at its disposal to encourage the peace talks in Syria and closer to home as well. We must also urge major investments in international assistance to rebuild war-torn societies and to create dignified jobs so that young people can form and support their families. So what does Pope Francis ask of us as peacemakers? He asks what Jesus asks of us. Work for justice, be merciful, and build peace. As Jesus taught in the Beatitudes, blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. May we all rise to the challenge of being children of God, of being peacemakers. Gracias.